Erev Tov, and welcome everyone. Tonight's class is about the laws of using electricity on Shabbat, or not specifically all the details, but just the very idea of why electricity is not, I'll say, engaged with on Shabbat. I'll unpack that more. What does it mean to use electricity on Shabbat? But electricity has a very interesting both history, which is quite young, as we'll learn a little bit about, but also it is viewed very differently by Jews of different walks of life. For example, I know a rabbi, he's not an Orthodox rabbi, but he considers himself to be observant of Jewish law, but he drives a Tesla on Shabbat because for him, not being a combustion engine with fire and everything like that, it's electricity. Electricity is no big deal, so he can drive a Tesla. And on the flip side of it, of course, you have Jews who won't touch any lights or anything whatsoever. Everything is on timers, and maybe they don't even use timers. The lights are left on. So there's different extremes about how Jews use or don't use electricity on Shabbat. So tonight we're going to explore how electricity fits in a Shabbat, and more importantly, why are there so many different views on it? Because within the sphere of observance, meaning if there's a Jew who's not observant and that is their choice, then it really doesn't matter about different laws and ins and outs of Shabbat. It doesn't matter whether it's a fire or cooking or going to a mall or anything like that. But electricity, it creates so much controversy. Someone could think of themselves as being completely observant of Shabbat, and they use electricity and they see that as not an issue at all. How is that possible? So before we get into electricity, a little bit of background that I've discussed in some past classes is, how do we know any of the laws of Shabbat? And without doing an entire class on it, the short answer is that it's actually a few weeks ago in the parasha, when it's talking about the building of the Mishkan, the tabernacle, and it specifically uses this phrase about not working, not doing melacha, this word in Hebrew melacha, on Shabbat. Don't do melacha on Shabbat. Now moving on, let's talk about building the Mishkan. And the Torah in multiple places says, don't do melacha on Shabbat, don't do melacha on Shabbat. And the question is, what is melacha? What does it mean to do work? Is work something that's tiring that you don't want to do? But what if it's you love doing building model planes? And technically that involves a lot of work. Would that be permitted? And the answer is generally no. So how do we define work? And the answer the rabbis give, because of how the Torah says don't do work, and here's how you build the Mishkan, the tabernacle, the rabbis say that all of the activities which are directly involved in building the Mishkan and the tabernacle is what the Torah defines as work. So for example, the tabernacle has curtains, around this big tent has curtains that are dyed and made of animal skin. So capturing animals, skinning them, preparing the skin, dyeing the skin, which includes cooking. And also in the Mishkan, they have chalot, these showbreads that they put out. So baking, and also putting together the Mishkan, hammering, building, just everything that the Torah delineates and in connection with building the Mishkan, that's what's forbidden on Shabbat. But the reason it's so important is, so the rabbi, you see this picture here, there are 39 categories the rabbis have, including things of farming. Why is farming involved? Because you need to do farming, you need to grow plants in order to make the food that you use within the Mishkan. So these are the 39 categories. Anything that fits into one of these categories is not permitted on Shabbat. And there's a very important distinction we'll see come out later. One of them is actually putting seeds in the ground for gardening. To actually do that would be to break a Torah law according to the rabbis. But if you do something that kind of looks like one of these categories, for example, if I take a plow and I go through the dirt and I'm making little holes in the dirt to put seeds in, that's breaking the Torah. That's breaking if I do it on Shabbat, I'm allowed to do it during the week. I do it on Shabbat, that's breaking the Torah. But what if I'm wearing shoes with a heel, or a woman with a high heel, or a man with a high heel, and on Shabbat they're walking through a field, or they're dragging a bench and they're accidentally making holes in the dirt? That's not intentionally doing it, so it's forbidden. One shouldn't actively do it, but if they've done it, they haven't broken a Torah law, maybe they've broken a rabbinic thing, and if it's totally accidental, they shouldn't do it, but it's not the end of the world. So there's a difference between doing one of these actual activities, hammering, making fire, etc., and doing things that look like them. Another one is sewing, like sewing the curtains, and they define sewing as attaching two things together. It's called tofer. So what are some things about attaching two things together that aren't actually sewing? Magnets. Attaching magnets, not magnets, stickers, because magnets are not meant to be permanent. Tofer is permanently attaching two things. So stickers are not the same as sewing, but it is permanently attaching two things. So it's forbidden to do, but not a Torah commandment because it's not actually sewing, but it's forbidden by the rabbis. And why that matters is the punishment for it would be less. And there's more exceptions. If you, for whatever reason, you have to put on a sticker, it's not as big a deal to put on a sticker as it is to actually do something which is sewing. So that's the basic idea of the melachot. It all has to do with 39 categories of building the Mishkan. If you actually do something that's one of these categories, like lighting a fire, extinguishing a fire, forbidden by the Torah, unless it's life or death, and anything that looks like one of these categories might be forbidden, but only rabbinically, which is still forbidden, but the punishment is less. And if there's some exception, like you really need to do a sticker for some reason, there's more room for leniency. So before we go into where and if electricity fits into this list, any questions up until now? Because this, what we just talked about, is a big principle for electricity. Yes, Jane. And then Jane, I will have you be our first to read. Just gotta click. Yeah, go for it, please.
Yeah, this is minutia, I guess. You can play baseball on Shabbat, can't you?
So the interesting thing about baseball is the fundamental act of playing baseball is not forbidden, but one has to be careful for a couple of things. One is it has to be inside of an eruv, because if they hit the ball or carry the bat or anything like that outside of an eruv, there could be an issue there. One of the things I just mentioned.
Yeah, that was my question. If you wear cleats.
So yeah, 100%, that could be an issue because it might be making, I don't know the agricultural term for it. I've forgotten it, but like making those little cuts in the dirt for sewing, that would be a problem. So if one were to do it on pavement inside of an eruv, it would be much more permitted. And you do indeed, I think, you have yeshivas, like very observant young men who will play sports game, but they'll be very careful about where they play it so they're not kicking up dirt, and doing it inside of an eruv. So it is possible to play sports on Shabbat. Now, there are certain things about not being too physically active because Shabbat is meant to be a day of rest and we don't do so much exercise. So maybe if it's super hot or don't run, there's all kinds of other little factors there. But again, it's not about, this is really important. Baseball is not forbidden on Shabbat, but one has to be careful that none of the parts of baseball get into any of these activities. So that's actually a great example. And that could be, someone asked me about swimming on Shabbat, maybe it was you, Jane, but that is a great, those are great examples to really understand how the melachot work. Look at an activity and say, does that activity fit into any one of these? Swimming itself doesn't directly fit into it, but wringing out a towel, spilling on, all these things might lead to. But now we're going to look at electricity, and the way we're going to do it is two main sources. The first one is a source I brought before, Peninei Halacha. It's a compilation on Jewish law written by this Israeli rabbi, Rabbi Eliezer Melamed. And while he is what we would consider, mainstream black hat orthodoxy, he was a student of the son of Rav Kook, which means that his view of other Jews is very positive. He is very generous of spirit and looks very positively upon Jews of a different observance, and really, is just constructive and how he reaches out. And while some of his rulings are stricter, he's often lenient, because he looks at the sources with this intellectual honesty. So again, he is not a modern Orthodox rabbi, but I think he has a great deal of respect outside of his community because of his intellectual honesty and his thoroughness in sharing all the opinions. And there are times when he's quite lenient, and a few times when he goes the complete opposite direction. It makes me raise an eyebrow. But what he does here, he's going to give an excellent summary of the different opinions on electricity. And one of the things to pay attention for is he's going to mention a bunch of sources and say, according to this rabbi, electricity fits into X category. And what we're going to think about as we go through is that true? Does electricity really fit into any one of these 39 categories? And one very important thing to consider, at the end of the source, I wrote 1925, why? Electricity was available to the public in the 1800s with Edison. It existed before that, but it became possible to put it in homes in the late 1800s, but it didn't become widespread until 1925. And even then, it was only in about half of US homes. We're only focusing on the States here. So while that's considered widespread, the point is that electricity is insanely new compared to most things. So if you want to talk about some new farming tool that's 500-600 years old, the rabbis will have plenty of time to figure out what it is. Does it fit a cooking implement? But electricity is really, really quite modern. And in fact, a lot of the opinions on it, as I'll point out in here, weren't even written until the 40s, until electricity was even more widespread. If it's not in your homes, you don't really need to worry about it. And that's important today when we have new things like smartwatches and computers that are also quite new. And the rabbis, again, are trying to figure out how do they fit into Shabbat observance. So I'll pause at certain points, Jane, to explain or point things out, but this is just a great summary of the different opinions. And more importantly, how do we practically rule? Regardless of whether or not electricity fits in, we all kind of know that electricity is not used on Shabbat. So go ahead, please, Jane.
One may not activate electrical appliances and devices such as telephones, microphones, alarms, doorbells, fans, air conditioners, and computers on Shabbat. And when he says activate, he means turn them on.
Correct. So if
they're on already.
Exactly. So a light can be left on, and we're not going to go into the details of timers and a timer which turns it on, like you said it before Shabbat. But yes, one generally is not permitted to go up to a computer and turn it on, move the mouse around, turn on an air conditioner, et cetera, like that. Please continue.
Even if these appliances do not contain an incandescent filament or heating element and do not perform any of the 39 malachot, it is still forbidden to use them on Shabbat. Acharonim disagree, however, whether the prohibition is by Torah law or rabbinic.
So two things to point out, and he'll come back to it. One is when he talks about incandescent filaments. This will be really important for a number of the rabbis here. Actually, the next thing here is that like an LED, like one of these modern newfangled lights, don't necessarily get hot, or they might get a little warm, but an incandescent light bulb has a piece of metal that gets so hot that it burns bright, like lighting something on fire. That's what it looks like experientially. So some rabbis look at that and say, okay, you're not technically making a spark, but it's getting hot and burning and creating heat like a fire. So I'll come back to that. And the other thing he says is, even if these appliances, once you turn them on and activate them, you're not turning on a sewing machine, you're not turning on a cooking machine. So these things aren't doing anything that breaks Shabbat. There's nothing wrong about being cool on Shabbat, but the act of actually turning on an air conditioner that activates electricity, that's the issue here. It's not what the electric device is used for, it's the actually activating it on Shabbat. So go ahead, please, Jane.
Some maintain that using any electrical appliance violates the Torah prohibition of mavir. They maintain that electricity has the same status as fire since, like fire, it has energy and power that can be harnessed. Rav Kook favors this position, arguing that the key aspect of fire is not its appearance, but rather its power to illuminate heat and provide power. Indeed, the sages state that there are different types of fire, Yoma 21b, including some that do not burn and destroy. One example of this is the fire that Moshe saw at the burning bush. Reb Uziel agrees with this approach, adding that turning on electricity is also prohibited as a form of mitaken mana, since activating an electrical appliance renders it useful.
So pause there for a moment. So this, Mushbatu Uziel. So yeah. This Rav Uziel from Israel, from back in the last century, not only does he agree with this idea of fire, he adds another idea, and you'll see this a lot of rabbis who say it kind of fits in this category, but it also kind of fits in this category. So they're just stacking things on top to make it more forbidden. But that also kind of means if you're adding a bunch of different reasons, it means none of those reasons is not as a knockout punch on its own. Either it's sewing or it's not sewing. It's cooking or it's not cooking. But more importantly, let's take a moment with this fire thing. So the idea of Rav Kook and the others that agree with him is the idea that it's not actually fire, but the point is that fire itself, that's not the important. We don't say that it's forbidden to use fire on Shabbat because it's fire. We forbid fire because of what it's used for, which is to create heat and to burn things. It's one of the fundamental building blocks of civilization. So a light bulb and the other things that work on electricity essentially can do similar things to fire. Now, for a number of reasons that doesn't quite pan out, again, for thousands of years, it was the idea of fire itself and adding fuel to fire. Like all of the laws around forbidden fire all developed assuming it was actual fire. The other thing that's important today is the kind of electricity we have today is it doesn't really heat up the same way that light bulbs did in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. So electricity today has really changed its nature. Now, if you ask Rav Kook, he'll say, again, it doesn't matter how it happens. The point is, fire gives power to our houses. Fire allows us to cook and clean and turn on televisions, and whatever electricity looks like, it's doing the same thing. So the fire argument, again, is if it looks like a duck and quacks like a duck, it must be a duck. So if it functions like fire to warm your homes and allow you to have light, then it must be fire. But again, that doesn't really match up with the historical development, because for vast majority of for all of halachic history, fire was fire. End of story, period. And that Talmudic source there is really interesting, but no one's used it before. And they're getting into midrashic, mystical thing about the burning bush and things like that. Before you go on, Jane, yeah, Rifki, just go ahead and unmute yourself. All right, yeah, go ahead.
So what if you, can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead.
So what if you have the air conditioning on beforehand and things like that?
Yeah.
Before Shabbat, and a fan on before Shabbat starts, and keep it on.
Absolutely. So that was his first point, is that turning these things on and off on Shabbat, and there's exceptions to all this in certain cases.
No, but I mean keep it on the whole time.
100% fine. You know, Sarah and I set everything before Shabbat. We actually have these smart plugs for warming trays, all that kind of stuff. I set it before Shabbat, and then I don't turn it on or off on Shabbat. It does it on its own, and that is the standard practice. We're not going to talk too much about all the little ins and outs, but if we have time at the end, you can ask more of those questions. But Rifki, that's 100%. An air conditioner can be left on before Shabbat, a fan, everything like that. And technically, a TV could be left on. Most rabbis will say don't do that because it ruins the Shabbat spirit. But in terms of breaking the work, like working on Shabbat and breaking a Torah law, technically it'd be permitted, but we're not going to go too much more into that. So great question. So, okay, Jane. So now we saw this Mavir thing, and now the Chazon Ish in 1946. And the reason he's important is because most people who say it's totally forbidden to use electricity on Shabbat by the Torah go to the Chazon Ish, Rabbi Karlitz. So please.
Chazon Ish maintains that turning on an electrical appliance is prohibited on account of boneh, because completing a circuit creates a kli.
A kli is a vessel, like a useful tool when one didn't exist before. Like if you have a bowl that has a hole in the bottom, you can't pour cereal into it. But if I fill it in with ceramic or clay or whatever, now I have a useful bowl, forbidden on Shabbat.
When electricity flows through a device, an electrical wire within comes to life and activates the device. Thus, one who completes a circuit builds an implement, and one who breaks a circuit demolishes it.
So before
Many others.
Sorry, we're about to go into another thing. Thank you for your patience in getting cut off, Jane.
No, that's all right.
So the Chazon Ish is one of the most brilliant, important, and authoritative rabbis of the last century. And he wrote this in 1946 when electricity was pretty widespread. However, while he maintains that building is certainly one of the fundamental things forbidden on Shabbat by the Torah, well, he claims it's forbidden by the Torah, which means much less room for leniency, without a question forbidden in any case. So a Tesla car, 100% forbidden. And many hold by him, and we're going to see it come back to the Chazon Ish. At the end of the day, it's Chazon Ish said it's forbidden by the Torah. It doesn't matter his reason, the Chazon Ish says it. The reason so that's why it's important, because it doesn't really matter what his reason is. If he thinks it's forbidden by the Torah, that's most of what people need to hear. But he might actually have the weakest of all the arguments. Why? Because the way that an electrical circuit is designed, a light switch, it's meant to go on and off, on and off. Whereas something which is built from scratch is basically, like I said, it's like a bowl that's totally useless, and you actually have to actively think about how to fix it, and it's useless before. But once you fix a bowl, you fill in the hole in it, you're done. Bowls are not designed for you to fill in the hole, eat your cereal, and then make a hole again. That's not how they work. But light switches are meant to go on and off. So for example, I cannot build a house on Shabbat. I can't take 4 walls, build a house, and make shelter. Totally forbidden. But if the Chazon Ish is correct in his thinking, then I can never close my door to my house on Shabbat. Why? Because when the door to my house is open, it's like there's a hole in my house. And when I close my door, then I am obviously fixing and building a wall. I'm making a complete enclosed wall. That's the silliest thing ever. Why is it not forbidden to open and close and lock your door? Because a door is designed to open and close. That's why building Legos on Shabbat is fine. Legos are meant to be put together and taken apart. Lincoln logs are meant to be put together and taken apart. Boneh, building that's forbidden by the Torah, is to permanently build something which was useless before, and now you want it to stay in the state. But electric circuits are meant to open and close like the door of a house. So again, rejecting his argument is the easiest thing in the world, but when the Chazon Ish says it, it doesn't really matter what he says. It's forbidden. But we'll come back to it. So go ahead, Jane. Many others maintain, however,
that using electrical appliances that do not contain an incandescent filament and do not perform one of the 39 malachot is only prohibited rabbinically, as it is considered a weekday activity. Additionally, some maintain that turning on appliances is prohibited because it is creating a new entity on Shabbat, molid, as it creates a new electrical current in the wires, Beit Yitzchak. No Torah prohibition is involved because there is no fire in appliances without an incandescent filament. There is no problem of boneh because an electrical circuit cannot be considered a kli, that is, an implement or receptacle. This is the opinion of Reb Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, Minchat Shlomo, and Reb Eliezer Waldenberg.
So before you conclude, Jane, so to go back, one interesting thing here is that pretty much everyone agrees that a light bulb, like the old school light bulbs that literally have a little metal piece inside that heats up and burns bright, pretty much everyone agrees that that's forbidden by the Torah. And why that's important is if somebody does not have candles and they want to light a Chanukiah or Shabbat candles, many rabbis, perhaps most, agree that if they have an incandescent light bulb, they can use that instead of Shabbat candles or a Hanukkah candle. They would not say that about an LED light bulb. So in a hospital, if someone's given an old school light bulb, they can say the blessing lehadlik ner, candle of Shabbat, because it has like a wick, it is something that gets hot and burns. But if they have these LED lights, these modern electric diodes, most rabbis would say it doesn't count and one can't say a blessing on it. So most agree that if it's an incandescent light bulb, it is a problem for Shabbat. But first of all, many light bulbs today are no longer that. And most electronics we're talking about are not necessarily light bulbs. We're talking about smartphones and smartwatches and computers and eventually Teslas and all these other things that don't have incandescent light bulbs. So that issue is knocked out. But again, if someone says, Rabbi, can I turn on an old school light bulb? Rabbi Dinan and vast majority of rabbis will say, no, that is forbidden. The second thing is if someone says, oh, I have a device and there's no incandescent light in it, it doesn't get hot, but it cooks food or it cuts grass or it does gardening for me. That would be forbidden, not because of the electricity, but because a person is turning on a device that breaks Shabbat in a different way. But those are the two important things. Again, if it is an actual old school light bulb that gets hot and burns like fire, everyone agrees that it's forbidden. Or if the device you're using directly breaks Shabbat in another way, forbidden. But again, most electronic devices walking into a building that has an electric door with a sensor that opens up. I had years ago, I needed to get into an apartment on Shabbat. I had to sit outside and wait for someone who was not Jewish to walk in before I walked inside because of the last thing he's going to say. But according to many rabbis, using a door with a sensor is certainly not forbidden by the Torah, but it is forbidden rabbinically because it looks like all these other categories, but it doesn't really fit into any of them. It's not really building, it's not fire. You're not creating anything new. The electrical current already existed there. So it doesn't fit into any of these categories. So why on earth is it forbidden? And Rabbi Shlomo Zalman Auerbach Zatzal wrote this incredible teshuvah, and he went through all these arguments. And he basically, just like I did, I didn't make this up. This is all based on Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach and his students. He rejected every one of those things. And he said, so at the end of the day, why don't we use fire? Why don't we use it? Because we don't, because that's been the custom for half a century. It's become accepted that it's forbidden rabbinically, and we give deference, this will come up again, we give deference and respect to rabbis like the Chazon Ish who think it is forbidden. Even if their argumentation is totally wrong, they gave a definitive ruling that it's forbidden, and while we can be lenient, we generally, and in fact, Jane, go ahead if you want to go ahead and finish it.
In practice,
that's where, yeah, he gives the practical ruling. Go ahead, please.
in practice, l'chatchila, we defer to the opinion that using electricity is a Torah prohibition. In times of need, when there are additional reasons to be lenient, we rely on those who believe that using electricity is only a rabbinic violation.
Excellent, thank you. So we started out with talking about anything that's forbidden on Shabbat either has to be directly one of those 39 categories or fit somewhat neatly into it. And if they appear to be like one of those categories, maybe it's only forbidden rabbinically, which still means we don't do it, but there's a lot of room for leniency and to do things indirectly, et cetera, like that. But as we saw here, electricity, with the exception of a hot incandescent bulb and a device that whatever you push the button and it directly breaks Shabbat, you push a button, it starts a sewing machine. With the exception of those two examples, electricity, especially the way we use it today, really doesn't fit into anything. But practically we don't engage and activate electronic devices. And the simple reason, there's two reasons for it. Either somebody holds by one of these rabbis and still thinks that it's fire or building, which again, it's very easy to reject. Or more likely, as Rabbi Shlomo Zalman Auerbach says, the reason it's forbidden is because rabbis of a greater generation, whether they were mistaken or not, forbade it, and that's become the custom of our people. However, practically speaking, there's a lot of room for leniency. And there's a rabbi in Israel who I studied under who said, look, if this keeps going in 20 years, when we get to a Star Trek future where everything is electronic, where you can't do anything without saying, hey, computer, turn this on or turn this off, it might become just accepted to do that, because they'll say, as long as you're not asking the computer to do anything that breaks Shabbat, if you say, computer, cook pancakes for me, no. But if you say, computer, turn on a light for me, and if it's not an incandescent bulb, it's fine. Computer, read a book to me. Computer, open the door. Computer, set an alarm. These things might one day, and again, many Jews who consider themselves observant of Shabbat, practice Shabbat in that way now. As long as it's not explicitly breaking Shabbat another way, to sit on one's computer and play solitaire or read an article, they think it's clearly not one of the activities of malacha, and reading is certainly forbidden or permitted on Shabbat, so it should be fine. Now, in practice, that is not where the Orthodox world is now. But again, for those who are understand it as rabbinically forbidden, barely, there's a lot of room for leniency. So before we go on to the next source, any questions up until now? Yeah, Rifki, go ahead and unmute yourself. You got it. Yeah, go ahead, Rifki.
Two questions about light bulbs.
Yes.
This light bulb, it's marked capital letters LE. And my son bought it for me for my lamp, and it's a migraine lamp. So I keep it on a certain color all the time.
Yeah, I can already tell.
Does that matter?
So there's two things here. I can tell by looking at that light bulb, it's one of the modern ones, which means it's going to last you forever and use up very little electricity. It is not an incandescent light bulb. So most rabbis would say that that is not forbidden by the Torah. However, again, in practice, one would not activate it, turn on or off on Shabbat. But by the way, even an incandescent light bulb, one can turn on before Shabbat. So the question is, with the light bulb holding in your hand, let us say, for example, this is a great example, Rifki. Somebody has one of the light bulbs you're holding in your hand, and it actually is known scientifically to lessen migraines. The question is, could someone then turn it on Shabbat? So the reality is that probably a rabbi would say that one could ask a non-Jew. So I know in your house, Rifki, there are other people living there. I don't know if they're all Jewish, but if one of them is not Jewish, you could on Shabbat say, oh, I have a migraine. Could you help with the light? And that's something that would be permitted because the light bulb you have is barely forbidden rabbinically, and a non-Jew is allowed to do what they want. So you're not actually turning it on. And there's a real need. And the real need is that somebody's in pain. So if you have two, we'll actually talk about that later, two things that are only forbidden rabbinically, which is we can't ask a non-Jew to just break Shabbat for us. We can't, you can't say cook for us, but you can imply that they should do something that is only forbidden by the rabbis, i.e. turn on an LED light if there's a need for it to help with a migraine or to not have.
What is an LED light? Is that the coil one?
So that I think is a halogen light. I mean, basically.
What is the coil one?
The vast majority of lights that we have today are not incandescent. That's the takeaway, is that this idea of electricity ever being forbidden by the Torah, it almost never comes up. It's at best
What's
forbidden within a Torah.
incandescent?
So I'm not going to go into the science here. But again, the important thing is that when we have light bulbs that are these new modern ones, there's so much room for leniency. And I see a question here from Kiri VO1. Go ahead and unmute yourself.
It's Menachem, Rabbi.
Oh, Menachem. Oh, it's so good to hear from you. Yes, your question, please.
Yeah, it's basically kind of two questions in one quickly.
Sure.
So you alluded to one of the problems. You said that you had to stay in a hotel somewhere, some time ago, and there was a sensor. So my question is, so it's increasingly common now, for the hotels, and I do stay in the hotels a lot of times, to have this sensors. Also, the keys to the doors in the hotels are also have this. You used to have regular keys, but not anymore. They have these cards. So the current, so to speak, approach of modern orthodoxy to this issue. That's, if you could give a comment.
Yeah, so the truth is, it's actually something that's very actively going on. So for people to understand, is like, it used to be for a hotel room, you just have a key, you turn it, no problem with Shabbat. But today they have key cards, you have to slide it through a door and activate a sensor. And the reality is that even in the modern Orthodox world, you really have two sides to it. You have the ones who say, just leave your door unlocked. And a lot of hotels, you often can request a room that has a traditional key or some way to get in. And often they have that because, let's say electricity breaks down or the battery dies, they often have some way to get the doors open. You can often request that. So you have rabbis saying that. But the other side of it, you have rabbis say, look, there's no other way to get in the room. We're only dealing with rabbinic things here. So there's a couple ways to get around it. One is, and we're not going to go into too much detail, the way, let's say someone's right-handed. The way they'll usually slide the card is they'll slide it with their right hand, like the way you would a credit card. So they'll say, do it with your left hand, or do it with your mouth, or do it with your elbow, or something like that. Do it in an atypical way, which lessens that when you do something irregularly, it's not as much of a violation. We're not going to go into the details of that. But again, the rabbis say, if you do something in a weird way, again, if I make holes in the dirt by walking with high heel shoes, not me personally, that's not the normal way to do it. So it lessens the violation. So I'm not making a ruling here. There are rabbis who would say, because it's rabbinic, there's no other way to get in. So there's absolutely a need for it. And if one does it in a regular way, it might be fine. Another probably much better way, if someone wants security and not leave their door unlocked, is to ask someone who works at the hotel and say, and explain before Shabbat, when I go home, do you mind just helping me into my room? Now, that's not always practical with schedule and everything like that, but those are the kind of three different sides. It's never permitted, so ask for a regular room or leave your door ajar. Two is, it could be permitted, just do it in an irregular way because there's no other way to do it and it's rabbinic at best. And the third way is to just ask a non-Jew before Shabbat or even on Shabbat, say, I can't get into my room, explain the situation, and then they'll let you in, put your card on the floor and you're in. None of those are seamless, but they're better than being stuck outside your hotel room all of Shabbat. Does that kind of help both practically and answer your question a little bit?
Oh, yes. Yeah, thank you.
Great. And by the way, if you want to call up to me and say, Rabbi, can you tell me a little bit more about those? And who are I said, I'm not giving a ruling here publicly, but I'm happy to share with you or anyone who are the rabbis that are sharing this, what are their suggestions? But all of those are opinions out there that are given by different rabbis. Excellent. Did you have a second question, Menachem, or was that kind of covered it?
No, it was one question. Basically, I was wondering, about the sensor. The door sensor in the entrance into the hotel, right? The doors opens automatically.
And as I mentioned, the rabbi in Israel who talked about the future where it's like Star Trek. This is going to become increasingly more of a problem as our houses become more automated to the point where we either shut down our houses and we can't function anymore, or we have to learn how to live with the reality of electricity. But the whole point here is it's not permitted, at least not a priori, ideally, but there's a lot of room for leniency. So excellent. Gloria and Leonard, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. So this next thing here is actually a footnote of the Peninei Halacha, but it's important because he goes into some more of the inside discussions and the history of this and how rabbis responded to each other, and again, practically what happens. So Gloria, if you would go ahead and take source number 2, please.
According to Rav Kook, using electricity is prohibited on account of mavir.
And mavir is making fire, igniting a flame.
Therefore, one may not speak into a microphone, as this increases the electric current.
So pause there for a moment. He's going to talk a little bit more about that, but the idea is that, let's say an electric current, which is considered fire because it gives power to something, is flowing, then if I have a device that I want to be louder or quieter, like a microphone, talking into it louder, it requires more electric current, i.e. adding fuel to the fire and increasing the fire. So if electricity is fire, then using something like certainly using activating any electric device is forbidden because it's going to be making a fire. But what if out of it's already in the on position? That's why this question is relevant. The microphone is already turned on. I'm not igniting a fire, but you cannot feed a fire and make a fire bigger on Shabbat. So any electric device, let's say a computer, clicking a mouse causes more electric current to go in, getting into an elevator that's technically always on. But if I'm pushing buttons, it's causing more electricity to surge through to go up and down. It's not turning it on from an off position, but it's causing more fire to go through. So if it's fire, as Rav Kook rules, then basically if it's fire and we're in big trouble, we're gonna have a lot of problems with electricity in the future. Fortunately, most people don't rule that way, but please continue, Gloria.
His responsa on the subject are not so well known, since responsa ora mishpat, in which they appear, was printed in 1979, 30 years after the main debates among contemporary Aharonim.
Acharonim, meaning the later, like I'm an Acharon, you're an Acharon, would you like to be an Acharon too? But basically the rabbis after the 1560s, when the Shulchan Aruch was written, anybody after that is considered the later generation. But this is so important because this is such a cool insight into the development of Jewish law. Rav Kook, and even though I disagree with him here, and I think many do as well, his conversations are basically not part of the conversation because he missed the boat. When all the big conversations about electricity were coming through, he wasn't part of his works weren't part of the conversation, and all of the rulings were made after that point. So it's very hard, even if a ruling had been written 1,000 years ago, if it wasn't on the books and didn't become popular, it doesn't really matter as much once mainstream practice has been codified. It's very hard to change it. So it's just a cool thing. It's like if they'd known about it at the time, our understanding of electricity might be very different. Please continue.
At the time, Hazon Ish was inclined to say that use of electricity is prohibited by Torah law on account of boneh.
Which is, building, closing a circuit, which, as we said, just is not a strong argument.
But many disagreed with him, including Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach and Rav Eliezer Waldenberg.
We're both Israeli rabbis.
Nevertheless, other Achronim share Rav Kook's opinion that the prohibition on electricity is due to mavir. Also see the entry on Hashmal.
Hashmal means electricity.
In the Encyclopedia Talmudit, which focuses on the opinions that disagree with Hazon Ish and maintain that the prohibition is rabbinic. One should be aware that according to Hazon Ish, if an appliance is already on, increasing the current to amplify the power of the appliance is not prohibited by Torah law. However, according to Rav Kook, who believes using electricity is prohibited because of mavir, increasing the current is prohibited by Torah law as well. Many contemporary authorities accept the opinion of Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach that there is no Torah prohibition involved in using electricity. However,
lechatchila means like, if you're going into the situation with no prior anything like that, it literally means like from the start. Like if somebody says, Rabbi, what's like the main ruling, the mainstream practice? This. But now what about exceptions? You didn't ask about exceptions. You said lechatchila, the main thing. And just before you go on, so just point that that's very interesting. If the issue is Hazon Ish, who says it's forbidden by the Torah because of building and completing a circuit, once the circuit's completed, go crazy. So according to the Chazon Ish, once a microphone is already on, hypothetically one can use it. Once a computer is on, as long as the circuits are already closed, and again, we're not going to get into how computers work, but let's say it's already on and activated, hypothetically one could use it. And the Chazon, and in fact, one of my colleagues wrote an interesting paper reinterpreting or at least clarifying what the Chazon Ish was writing about. And based on it, he said things like smartwatches, which are already on, might be permitted. So it's even though Chazon Ish is really strict about electricity, it might actually lead to a great leniency, because as long as these devices are already activated, you can't activate them on Shabbat, that's forbidden by the Torah, but once they're on, have fun. But according to Rav Kook, who's not the mainstream one, but he says that if it's the same as fire, then any feeding the flame, adding fuel to the flame is forbidden. Any engagement with electric devices, from turning touching your digital watch to changing channels on a digital TV, all that would be forbidden because it changes the electric flow. So very interesting how both rabbis think it's forbidden by the Torah, but for totally different reasons. And it all goes back to the 39 categories of work and where does it fit in? And again, as we've seen, it doesn't really fit in anywhere. But as you said, however, lechatchila, most people forbid it, even if they don't think it's forbidden by Torah law. The fact that two big rabbis said it is, we generally are strict on it. And then it mentions Igrot Moshe, Rav Moshe Feinstein, the great Orthodox American rabbi. Go ahead, maintains. It's after that parentheses, yeah.
Maintains that the status of the prohibition is unclear.
Which means he'd probably say, then just better safe than sorry. Please continue.
In practice, although many state that in principle the prohibition on using electricity is rabbinic, in fact, they relate to the prohibition of turning on electrical appliances as if it were prohibited by Torah law. Thus, even in cases of uncertainty and cases where electricity is required for the sake of a mitzvah to avoid substantial loss or to help someone who is bothered by a minor illness, they are not lenient and prohibit using electricity via a non-Jew or when activated with a shinui.
So the word shinui in Hebrew means a change. That's what I talked about with Menachem's question is, if I'm right-handed, the way I'll turn on a light switch is I'll flick it with my right hand. But if I actually haven't done this on Shabbat, but if someone were to literally go up to a light switch and flick it on with their nose, even if flicking on a light switch is forbidden by the Torah, if I literally turn it on with my nose, which is not the normal way to do it, it would only be forbidden rabbinically. So if I were punished for it, I wouldn't get punished for breaking a Torah commandment. I would get punished for breaking a rabbinic commandment because I did it in this weird way. And there are plenty of people who, again, in extreme cases, might, close a refrigerator door or do something like that with their elbow, with their knee, with their nose, holding up their baby's tush. These are all kinds of things where it's like, I can't technically do it in the normal way, but I need to do it. So how do I make it not as bad? And that's a key phrase, not as bad, is I do it in a weird way. But they're saying here that practically speaking, we're not really lenient with electricity. Now, again, this is where, not that I disagree with Rabbi Melamed, but this is where maybe a modern Orthodox rabbi who's still just as observant of law might say, no, there are more leniencies than he's listing here. But generally, we say that activating electricity is forbidden with certain exceptions. So go ahead, please continue.
Despite the fact that each of these scenarios would constitute a shvut.
And again, I explained the shvut before. Shvut it's from the word Shabbat, which means something that you cease or I don't do. Don't cook on Shabbat. Don't turn on lights on Shabbat. Don't ask a non-Jew to break Shabbat for you. However, a lot of these categories are forbidden only rabbinically. So if I take two things that are forbidden only rabbinically, which we're still not allowed to do, and I combine them together. So let's say electricity is not permitted, but it's only forbidden by rabbinic enactment because it kind of looks like these categories. And a non-Jew is allowed to do whatever they want on Shabbat. They're not Jewish, but I'm really not supposed to ask them to break Shabbat for me rabbinically. But if I put those two together and I ask a non-Jew to turn on a light switch, it's two rabbinic things. So it's like the 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon. It's 2 or 3 times removed from actually breaking Torah law. And if there's a real reason for it, let's say my house is miserably hot because it's 95 degrees outside, and I ask my non-Jewish neighbor and I say it's miserably hot, wink, wink, and they come in and turn on the air conditioning, I'm technically not allowed to ask Jews to break Shabbat, and I can't turn on an air conditioner. But if you combine it together, I'm so many things removed, and there's a need for it. Shabbat is miserably hot, then it might be permitted. And he's saying that we try not to be lenient as much as possible. And I'm saying in the real world, people are much more lenient than he's implying here. Please continue.
Only in cases of true necessity do they take into account the opinion that the prohibition is rabbinic. Therefore, the only way these appliances can be used on Shabbat is if they are turned on before Shabbat. In times of true necessity, they can be used through grama.
I'll explain grama in a moment. I'll just let you finish the paragraph.
Meaning that one's actions will not directly or immediately cause the appliance to turn on. Examples of the permitted use of electricity on Shabbat include wearing a hearing aid and adjusting the setting on a timer.
Excellent. So I'm not going to go into all of that, but very quickly with a hearing aid is, as long as it's left on before Shabbat, then it's fine to use. Technically, obviously, there's electricity running through it, but because there's an absolute need for it, and like a really serious need for it, someone who's not able to hear, and there's an absolute need for it, and as long as it's left on before Shabbat and it's only electricity, then it really gets out of all these situations. And my point here is that when he says only in cases of true necessity, the way that people define true necessity, people will rely on these leniencies more often. And I'm not talking about modern liberal Jews. I'm talking about ultra-Orthodox Jews. If their power goes out and the only way that they can have Shabbat lunch is by having a light go on, and it's not an incandescent bulb, it's an LED bulb, like the light bulb that Rifki showed, then they might say to, depending on where they're living, there may not be any non-Jews, but if they have Elvis Presley, a Shabbat goy, they might say, oh, it's so dark in the house. Again, they do it in this indirect way. And the non-Jew, if they have a good positive relationship, will come and be like, don't worry, I got you, buddy. And they'll turn on the air conditioner. And I've seen, again, what we would call ultra-Orthodox rabbis relying on this. Not all the time. And there's certainly Jews. I've even seen very Orthodox Jews that I say, you're relying on these leniencies way too much. I've been stricter than them. But the reality is this. While the practice is not to turn electric devices on and off, most people basically get that even though we respect the Chazon Ish, we respect Rav Kook, like deeply respect, and we have all of them, most agree it's not really a Torah commandment, and there's plenty of ways of being lenient when there's a need. And how you define a need, most of the time it has to do with air conditioning and not sitting in darkness. It's not about I was playing solitaire or chess on my computer, and wink, wink, I think the queen should take that pawn. It's not what we're talking about with a non-Jew, like moving your mouse. We're talking about cases of like real need that'll affect one's ability to keep Shabbat. But again, the only reason we can do those leniencies is that fundamentally, electricity is not fit in one of the categories. It's only rabbinically forbidden. And again, the reason it's rabbinically forbidden is basically because it's rabbinically forbidden. The reason I say that is it doesn't really fit into any of the categories. It's not like stickers that look like sewing. It's not like this that looks like that. It's not like dragging chairs through dirt that looks like you're gardening. You're not, but it looks like it. Electricity doesn't really fit nicely into everything, but the practice has become, it's almost custom becoming law that we don't use it. And the flip side of it, before we read our final source, is let's say someone takes what I just said to its logical conclusion, which many do. Rabbi, you basically said electricity is fine, so let's just use it. Okay, Shabbat dies. If electricity becomes permitted in all of its forms, Shabbat is gone. What's going to distinguish Shabbat from the rest of the week? We're all going to end up, God willing, with electric cars soon. So driving on Shabbat becomes permitted. Most of us, 99% of what we do is we watch Netflix or we listen to music on the radio and all these things like that. Electricity's permitted, fine. And even timers. If I want to watch the Red Sox game, I'm only saying that because I love my mother-in-law. If I want to watch the Red Sox game, so I set a timer on the TV. Timers are permitted. It turns the TV on. Rav Moshe Feinstein did not like timers. Why? Because he felt that with timers, you could basically do away with the Shabbat. You could have all the music and TVs going on and off. You couldn't control them, but basically Shabbat would be gone from your house, and fully permitting electricity will do the same thing. And that's a huge question that we need to face. And in this era of Zoom, and particularly this came out in Pesach a few years ago, where they talked about having Zoom seders where the computer's on before Shabbat. You don't have to turn anything off, and leaving it in the corner. And rabbis, and technically that can be permitted, but rabbis in Israel excoriated and was so angry at the rabbis saying this. What are you doing? You're ruining Shabbat. You're totally wrong. If their argument is on a technical one, then these rabbis being strict, they don't have a leg to stand on. If their point is, this is kind of a dangerous, slippery slope, and if we allow for services to constantly be on Zoom and everything like that, then, what does Shabbat look like? And I personally had to struggle with that question over the last few years when people said, why don't we do services on Zoom? Can it be technically done? Maybe kind of technically, but Shabbat disappears. So what I want to do right now is I'll read this very last source. This is from one of the most incredible articles from two brilliant rabbis, and one of them I've met a number of times. So Rabbi Michael Broyd and Rabbi Howard Jachter. And Rabbi Jachter is one of my personal heroes. And they wrote this incredible article where they go through every single opinion on electricity and basically not reject them all, but basically that's what they do. And their conclusion is a beautiful summary of everything we just talked about. So in the end, they say the use of electricity on Shabbat and Yom Tov, we didn't go into that, but it'll be Yom Tov as well, is a relatively new and exceedingly complex area of halacha. The variety of positions taken by the decisors is broad, and these differences are extremely relevant to the conduct of observant Jews, as we saw. It is the near unanimous opinion that the use of incandescent lights on Shabbat is biblically prohibited. Beyond that, there's little agreement, and that's basically what we saw in the work, the Penine Halacha. Some authorities maintain that anytime a circuit is opened or closed, a biblical violation occurs. That was the Chazon Ish with the Bone, the building the circuits. Other authorities insist that the use of electricity absent lights is only a rabbinic prohibition. So creating light is the issue, but using a computer, no big deal. Still, other authorities accept that in theory, the use of electricity without the production of light or heat is permitted. And again, that's like smartwatches and things like that. And again, what does Shabbat look like? Although even those authorities admit that such contact is prohibited absent great need because of tradition. That's Rabbi Shlomo Zalman Auerbach. And I think Rabbi Eliezer Melamed, who wrote the two sources we read, I think he kind of would agree with that idea as tradition is too powerful. The variety of grounds prohibiting the use of electricity is reflected in discussion of specific appliances. Now they're going to get into some interesting practical examples. Many authorities permit opening a refrigerator door on Shabbat, even if the motor is off, because if I open the fridge and I leave it open for a long time, it's going to activate the motor. But it's not going to be, it doesn't activate it every time. It's indirect. I don't care if the motor's on or off, all of these things, and it's fine because it's rabbinic. Many authorities permit opening a refrigerator door, even if the motor is off, some do not. While all concede that the radio and television cannot be used on Shabbat and Yom Tov, the nature of the prohibition is a dispute. Meaning some might say no TV or radio because electricity is forbidden by the Torah, and others might say it's just going to ruin the Shabbat atmosphere. So they all agree, again, even a rabbi as myself, somebody, can I watch TV on Shabbos? No, we don't. Why, Rabbi? That's the question. So too, all but Rabbi Auerbach concede that a telephone cannot be used on Shabbat. Even he prohibits it absent great need. So Rabbi Auerbach might be more lenient on a telephone. And again, we're not going to go into that. You'd have to read his responsa about why a telephone doesn't hit on any of these issues. But even then, he says, ideally, we wouldn't use it. However, there's no consensus as to the source of the prohibition. Again, if you say, why can't we use a phone? Because and there's a lot of that. Well, because we don't. The use of timers is equally in dispute. Remember I said Rav Moshe Feinstein did not like them, but you ask most rabbis, if you ask me, if you say, Rabbi Dinan, can we use timers on Shabbat? Yes. I don't need to equivocate or dither about that. Timers are fine, but not everyone agrees. While nearly all concede that timers may be set on Friday to work on Shabbat, adjusting such timers on Shabbat and Yom Tov is still in dispute. Old kind of timers, you have these little buttons that you physically push up and down. So if a timer is on and there's a little switch inside, and if it hits one of the buttons, it'll go on or off. What if I pull out some of those buttons? I'm not actually turning the light on or off, but I can change what the light will do when it does or doesn't hit one of those buttons. And rabbis debate about doing that. Can you change what the reality will be indirectly on Shabbat. I use smart plugs instead of timers that I have to set with my phone. So it doesn't matter either way for us. But the most important takeaway of this is not only the complex development of Jewish law, but the fact that this is still relevant, and it's going to become more and more relevant as electricity or electric devices become more prevalent. Our entire homes will be completely automated. And not only will it be a practical halachic, what's technically permitted, what's not, but also what does Shabbat look like? Because again, if I live in a Star Trek future, Shabbat really doesn't mean as much anymore. Maybe it's going to shul, maybe it's having a nice meal with my family, which is beautiful, but that's not what Shabbat has been for thousands of years. The idea of the day of rest goes out the window, and that's a real question that we really have to struggle with, but we also need to be intellectually honest about the rulings we make. If I say something's forbidden by the Torah, is it actually forbidden? Or am I just trying to create a Shabbat atmosphere? And if I try and trick people and say, oh, it's forbidden by the Torah, but I don't have a leg to stand on, people will see through that. So we need a combination of honesty about why Shabbat is important, what it should look like, and what the rulings actually are and are not.